Back in the Roman era, the island of Britain was overwhelmingly Celtic. But just a few centuries later, it was, well, England. And that wasn't just a name change. We're talking a total shift in language, in culture, everything. So how on earth did a Celtic island become so completely Germanic? It's a question historians have been wrestling with for ages. But now, ancient DNA is stepping in to tell the story. And believe me, the answer is not what anyone thought.
For the longest time, there were basically two competing stories to explain this massive change. On one hand, you have the old medieval accounts which paint this picture of a huge, violent invasion. Waves of Anglo-Saxons coming over, conquering the land, and basically pushing the native Britons out. But then, a more modern theory suggested something totally different. Maybe it was just a small group of influential Germanic elites who arrived, and the local population just kind of adopted their culture over time. A peaceful shift, not a conquest.
So you had these two camps, mass invasion versus cultural influence, and it seemed like we'd be debating it forever. But then, a powerful new tool entered the scene, a tool that promised to cut right through the speculation and look directly at the genetics of the people involved.
Okay, so starting around 2015, the first big genetic studies started to tackle this question. What they did was pretty clever. They compared the DNA of people living in England today with populations in places like Wales and continental Europe to try and figure out just how much Anglo-Saxon DNA the average English person actually has. And as more studies came out, a really consistent picture began to form. All the data seemed to be pointing in the same direction. Study after study kept landing on a similar number, that on average, only about a third of the ancestry of people in England actually came from these Germanic migrants. The vast majority of the gene pool, it seemed, was from the native Britons who had been there all along.
The conclusion felt pretty solid. It looked like science had finally settled the debate, and it was siding with that cultural shift theory. The genetics suggested it was a pretty small migration, probably led by some influential minority, and not some massive population replacement. Case closed, right?
Well, not so fast. There was a pretty fundamental problem with this whole approach. See, all of these studies were trying to reconstruct the distant past by looking at people who are alive today. But think about it. More than 1,000 years of history have passed, with Vikings, Normans, and all sorts of other groups coming in. All of that later mixing could have seriously diluted the original genetic signal, making it really hard to see what actually happened way back then.
But then, a technological breakthrough completely changed the game. It meant scientists could stop trying to look back through the fog of time, and instead, go directly to the source.
And that breakthrough is called ancient DNA analysis. This is just incredible stuff. Instead of guessing about the past based on the present, researchers could now take skeletal remains and sequence the entire genomes of people who are actually living during the migration period. This gave them a perfect high-definition snapshot of the population from that exact moment in time. So in 2022, a massive landmark study did exactly that. They analyzed hundreds of ancient genomes from all across Britain and Europe. And when the results came in, they didn't just tweak the old story. They completely blew it up. The difference between the old data and the new data was just wow. Remember those early studies using modern DNA? They pointed to about 35% migrant ancestry. But what the ancient DNA showed was something else entirely.
I mean, the scale of this is just breathtaking. In the heartlands of what would become England, the study found that a staggering 76% of the average person's ancestry came directly from continental Northern Europe, the Anglo-Saxon homelands. This wasn't some small elite group, this was huge.
The conclusion was just undeniable. The genetic evidence was overwhelming. The birth of England was, without a doubt, fueled by mass migration. A massive movement of people that fundamentally and permanently reshaped the genetic landscape of the entire island.
So genetics gave us a crystal clear answer on the scale of the migration. It was massive. But, that just opens up another huge question, doesn't it? What was the nature of that migration? Was it really the violent, bloody conquest from those old medieval stories?
And here's where the genetics gave us another fascinating clue. The DNA showed that there were just as many women migrating as there were men. So this wasn't simply an army of warriors coming to conquer. We're talking about entire communities, men, women, families crossing the North Sea to find new lands to farm and settle. And funnily enough, that actually lines up with some of those old written accounts.
And this is a really crucial point. Just because families were moving, it does not mean it was peaceful. Think about it. When a massive number of new people move into a territory that's already populated, conflict over land, over resources, it's almost inevitable. So the presence of families certainly doesn't rule out violence.
So,
While genetics has definitively answered the question of how many, it leaves us with these profound questions about how. How violent was it, really? How did these two groups, the locals and the newcomers, actually integrate? Was it a forced coexistence, or was there willing cooperation? The DNA simply can't tell us what life was actually like day to day in those new settlements.
This incredible study has completely redrawn a key chapter of history, bringing us so much closer to understanding the true origins of England. But it's also a powerful reminder that the past is always holding on to its secrets, just waiting for that next scientific breakthrough to bring them into the light. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.